Good evening, audience. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for tuning into this first episode of Polaris interviews and book reviews. This first episode will be presented to you by myself, Alexander Wolfheze, who is a member of a larger panel at this moment. And one of our panelists is joining me tonight to talk about one of his books, Hiroshima Revisited. And this book is written by person that perhaps some of you might know from other publications as well, Dr. Michael Palmer from Germany and from Canada. And I'm happy to have you here as our first guest for this series. Dr. Palmer, can you please introduce yourself and say something about your background for the benefit of our audience who is tuning in for the first time?
Good. First, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. As you mentioned, I'm originally from Germany, as you might guess from my accent also. So I have lived in Germany for 40 years. I received my medical training there at the University of Gießen. Then during the 1990s, I worked at the Institute of Medical Microbiology at Mainz University together or under the supervision and guidance of Professor Sucharit Bhakti. After that time, I went to North America, first 1 year in Texas, and then in 2001, I moved to Canada and took up a professorship for biochemistry in the Department of Chemistry at Waterloo University, and that continued until 2022, when I was asked, or when I was compelled, I was supposed to take the COVID vaccine, and I refused, for which I got fired, which in hindsight was rather a blessing than a curse, because I really enjoy the freedom I have gained through this. And I have, in the time since then, been able to focus more on the things that I am truly interested in. The book that you mentioned, Hiroshima Revisited, so the idea, the key thesis of that book is that after all, there were no real nuclear weapons detonated in Japan. And it discusses both the physical and the medical evidence in support of this thesis, and goes also a little bit into the historical context. I became interested in this question in 2018. So the idea that there were no nukes in Japan didn't really start with me. I've stumbled upon it on the internet, and I don't even recall exactly where I found it first. Now, you might wonder why I even took this idea seriously. Probably a few years before that, I wouldn't have taken it seriously. But in 2016, I had stumbled upon a video online that showed the spontaneous implosion of World Trade Center Tower 7, a third building at that site into which no airplane ever had crashed or was even alleged to have crashed. Now, this obviously didn't add up, so it was very obvious simply from the aspect of it that this had to be some kind of controlled demolition. So I looked into that a little bit, and the realization, I hadn't up to that time even questioned the official story of 9/11. But the realization that we had truly been told a huge fairy tale, and that this fairy tale was still vigorously being maintained by the media and the governments of the world, made me wonder, if this big lie is being told and upheld, what other big lies and stories might be told and upheld as well. So I went down a couple of rabbit holes, and as part of those various investigations I started in my spare time, I came upon this thesis. Now, the what was intriguing about this Hiroshima story was that, on the one hand, there was some fairly compelling evidence, for example, from one eyewitness, whose testimony I also discuss in my book, that is Alexander Seversky, originally from Russia. Then he went to the United States. He had been sent by the US Department of Defense on an inspection tour to Japan after the war, and he had reported that the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki looked more or less the same as any other city in Japan that had been destroyed by conventional firebombing. On the other hand, you have all this scientific evidence, all these scientific studies in the published literature that show radioactive fallout, evidence of neutron radiation, and so on and so forth, medical evidence that seem to solidly support the idea that indeed nuclear detonations have happened. So, because the truth has to go one way or the other, I decided to investigate this. And the book is indeed the result of the investigation. And I am, after reviewing quite a bit of evidence, I'm fairly certain, I'm actually very certain, that indeed no nuclear weapons were detonated in both of these cities.
Well, the audience will gather from what you just said, how you described your own CV, your curriculum, and my first glance also at your online work, which, by the way, is freely accessible to our audience. Links will be posted under this podcast. From this self-evident, quite impressive CV and impressive book, people will gather that we are here talking with a real scientist, a heavyweight scientist in many respects, and that what has happened to you, namely the fact that you were removed from your university and that your books have been in fact shadow banned around the world. I think this is something that now people, after the COVID scandemic, people will understand better. People can now perhaps relate to this on this topic. As you yourself have gone through the process of questioning great narratives, I think many of our audience will have gone through the same process at some point or another. But I must admit that your thesis, namely that there were no nuclear bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, is quite shocking. Of course, all of us live in an environment with furniture. That means things that have been placed in our head by our schools, our universities, our parents, and other authority figures. And a very large piece of furniture is the fact of the supposed fact that there were these events, there were these nuclear bombings. So
Yes.
I think that any kind of thesis pertaining to historical revisionism after the experiences of 9/11 and after the experiences of the COVID scandemic are justified, yours as well. That's why I read the book. I actually went through it, which is quite an achievement because it's a very thorough scientific book. Let me say that for the benefit of our audience, because this is supposed to be a book review, and let me just give them my impression of this book. It reads like a coroner's report. So it just reads like somebody is doing a post-mortem on an event, and doing so from a scientific, medical, and biochemical point of view, with expertise to back it up. That said, the book has a rather narrow focus. It does not state that no nuclear bombs are feasible. It does not state that no nuclear tests were ever held. It does not state that there are no nuclear weapons. It just states that there were no atomic bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That is the thesis of the book. So it's a narrow focused book. And people should keep that in mind before jumping to all kinds of conclusions. And I like to, because it is a book review, quote a short sentence just to take some of the doubts of the intent behind this book out of the air. So the writer, Mr. Palmer here with us, writes this. This treatise attempts to get at the truth, but cannot lay claim to the whole truth. Too much evidence remains hidden from view, even 75 years after the events. But also, the author writes, between moral embarrassment and scientific impossibility, the only sound choice is the former. That means scientific impossibility. We all expect the fortitude to make such choices correctly in the members of a jury. Here, in this book, that means we should expect the same of ourselves. I think this is a very straightforward sentence which speaks for itself. I'd only like to add, before I go on asking you questions, to say that of course, here the term 75 years is used. In the meanwhile, we have moved on. And you have said in your book that the greatest hoax of all time may have been the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. And of course, that has been overtaken by events, because I'm sure that we can agree that the COVID scandemic has definitely reached that same level of, well, let's say, yes, of hoaxing. Another thing that fits with the time frame that we are talking now in is your conclusion that you're stating quite early on that science is, with a good word from your own language, put. Many people will know what that means. It's broken. So let me first start with the effect of writing this book, because it is not just that you have put a lot of work in it. You have also put your reputation on the line, and I would say probably even some of your well-being on the line, because going against this kind of this magnitude of narrative must have had a big impact on your life. I mean, I gathered a little bit from your book. You write, for example, one sentence here. Among the members of my own family, the manuscript found a decidedly mixed reception. I appreciate both their encouragement and their rejection because they show me early on what kind of echo to expect when trying to tell this far out story. Now, we have moved on in the meantime. We have had the COVID pandemic behind us. It has been 5 years since you wrote the book, or a little more. Do you think that your book at the moment finds a better reception, a more understanding public? Has it been spread? How has been the success of the book, if we may use that word?
Yeah, well, I mean, the success, as far as it goes, I mean, it is certainly limited, and I don't think very many people are aware of the book. I did not even try to find a publisher for the English language version for various reasons. The key reason actually being that I didn't want to sign away the copyright, because I mean, you sell the copyright to some publisher, and then the publisher gets pressured by somebody, and then the book is buried, and you don't even have the copyright to your own work anymore. So that was clear; it needed to be free. Then so I simply put it up online, and it has been slowly spreading. And I think the spread has actually, the reach has increased over the years, and probably indeed, as you suggest, in the current climate after COVID, I think more people are willing to entertain the idea. More people are open-minded and are willing to give it a look. Then I actually have myself translated the book into German, and that has been published by a regular, if small, print publisher in Germany. The book has also been, to my delight and surprise, translated to Japanese. That was really quite interesting. So my Japanese translator is, like myself, an MD, but he is a clinician. He has a fairly broad range of interest and experience in clinical and clinical specialties, and he is actually a plastic surgeon with his focus of interest being burn wounds. And because of that expertise, he had himself been roped in by the major Japanese radio station or TV station as an expert in to advise them on some sort of documentary series on the bombings. And in that context, he gave the evidence a close look, and he had come on his own already to similar conclusions that the official story didn't add up. Okay. And I approached him not knowing of this background. I found a paper online of his. He had written on some model experiments to replicate the effects of atomic flashes on skin and the resulting skin wounds and so on, skin burns. And I found this paper quite remarkable for its very unusually wide selection of references. So it was not just simply the usual mix of papers drawn from the medical specialist literature, but there were eyewitness testimonies and whatnot, poems and this kind of. So this showed a very broad range of interest of this person. So I thought it was interesting. So I approached him with a few questions. He actually helped me also while I was still researching the book. He dug up a couple of Japanese journal articles for me, and translated them. Neither of us shared our fundamental skepticism. So we just communicated like two serious medical doctors communicating about some specialist topics. And once I was done with the book, I actually sent him the manuscript to sort of review myself. And then he very shortly after afterwards replied that, oh yeah, great, congratulations, I've come to the same conclusion and so on. And then he undertook a translation of the book, and that was also published through his usual book publisher. So he has himself written a couple of other books on different topics. And in Japan also, the book initially just languished, but in the last year or so, it actually picked up interest. And that might again also be related to the COVID experience.
Well, for the benefit of our audience who might opt to read part of your book or not at all, I would like to give us a brief overview of the content of the book so that people understand what we are talking about here. This is a book that is 300 pages approximately, including a large number of scientific footnotes, 300 of them, which is made up for a large part of, let's say, witness testimony, evidence, quotes, verbatim or otherwise, translated material from different sources, and everything is referenced. So we are talking here about the scientific work first and foremost. That said, it is not just a scientific treatise. It does offer a number of introduction to important topics that need to be understood in order to understand the thesis for in layman's terms. So somebody wants to know how radioactivity works or how a nuclear explosion would theoretically work, can also read this book with benefit. They will find out how that actually works. Then as well, there are some chapters that give brief introductions to medical terminology and medical science relevant to the investigation. So, for example, the effects of napalm or the effects of mustard gas specifically on the body. These things are explained in great detail, and then later on related to evidence. So it's a book that has a very logical setup. In that sense, it's very easy to read. The first chapter gives an introduction, so why to doubt these events, supposed historical events in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Then it follows a second chapter, which is very useful. It's a primer. It talks about radiation and radioactivity. And then the book continues with a number of chapters on physical findings. So I will specify number 3, nuclear fallout, 4, residual radioactivity, and number 5, gamma ray thermoluminescence. We will ask Dr. Palmer later on what these things mean, and the 6th chapter on neutron radiation. So these are physical findings that are investigated. Then chapter 7 contains an important hypothesis, giving a primer, introducing the hypothesis on the use of mustard gas and napalm. So then there follow a number of chapters on, let's say, the direct aftermath of the bombing. So the evidence from the direct aftermath of the events of the 6th and 9th of August 45. Chapter 8, radiation sickness. Chapter 9, skin burns. Chapter 10, various clinical and pathological findings. And then this is followed up by analysis of long-term effects, talking about radiation dose, cancer and leukemia. And finally, there are 2 chapters, the first of which is still scientific in nature, namely a technical reconstruction, how this event was really staged, so it really took place. And number 14 goes into speculation, but it is specified as such and kept separate from the rest of the book. And that is, of course, going into the question why. So again, to repeat, 300 pages of dense scientific research of a highly technical nature mostly, 300 footnotes to back it up, dozens of scientific tables and stats, and anybody with an alpha brain, which means humanities brain like myself, burns out even trying to read it. In any case, I've done so, and I think we should thank Mr. Palmer, Dr. Palmer here for his work, because this is an incredible achievement given the fact that he has not been given assistance or access to actually quite important research facilities which he should have. He has done so on a purely individual basis, and it is his own merit to have come up with this book which I think is a great achievement. Let us go into the first chapter, which states the big question that will hang over everybody listening to this interview and everybody even thinking about starting to read your book. And this is the why doubt question. This is the most essential starting point of the book. Let me preface that with two remarks. First, that outside of the scope of the book is the question of technical feasibility of building an atom bomb. So this is not addressed. We are not talking here about whether it is possible at all, technically speaking, to build an atom bomb. The only thing Dr. Palmer has done is add the note saying that the speed of development in 44, 45 suggests otherwise, that it is not feasible, at least at that time. But that is just a minor speculation. Another preface that should be given to this first chapter, why doubt, it is the missing evidence. So Dr. Palmer immediately informs us that a lot of vital evidence is missing, namely accurate records that should have been made where there's a real first of atomic explosion, namely the measurements that should have been taken for the bombing effects, the shock wave, its spread, its speed, and so on, its dispersal. These are not available, or in a very small measure only. Then the second is the absence of early radiation measurements, which started actually only in October, as far as the official records go. Then a third circumstance which limits the scope of the evidence, and that is the confiscation of Japanese research. So not only was equipment destroyed and absconded from Japan, including the Japanese cyclotrons, because the Japanese did have some of those, but also the records that are being kept by scientists who did Japanese research into the events at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is just two major caveats that has to be mentioned here. Then I would like to give the word to Dr. Palmer here to talk about two essential and contradictory eyewitness reports. So you already mentioned Alexander Defenceless, so that is the person that got quick access to the site.
Yes.
And,
So he visited. Sorry.
Yes, and you contrasted that to the observations of the official Japanese observer, first scientific observer who was sent there. Can you tell us something about those observations on both sides?
Good. So the Alexander Defenceless, this Russian-American aeronautical engineer, he visited both Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early September, so just a few short weeks after the bombings. And I think he only stayed for a few days in each city, maybe 2 days in each city, something like that. And he really states explicitly in his autobiographical work, and that deals with that, he states explicitly that he did not find anything. He was scrutinizing the city of Hiroshima and likewise Nagasaki for any signs that would set apart these cities and that would give a specific hint to the nuclear detonations supposedly having occurred there. And he says explicitly that he did not find any of these findings. Okay, and it is quite interesting to contrast this with later statements. There was another American officer, Averell Lebo. He actually came originally from Austria. He was in the city. He arrived there in mid-October, so some 6 weeks after Defenceless, and he made a big thing of the various atomic shadows that you may have heard of, right? So he shows some photographs of shadows on the pavement on a bridge and so on, and he describes several other sites, and he also illustrates in his own book several other such findings in the cities. So then the question arises, why did Defenceless not find those, while Lebo found them? That, I think, points quite clearly to these things having been created, having been out of thin air artificially between those two visits. So sometime between early September and mid of October, these things must have been sort of painted on the pavement and on the walls and so on. Okay, so you mentioned some Japanese witnesses specifically. You may be referring to the atomic physicist who went there early on.
Yes, you said that he was sent there by the government and he made a report stating that this was definitely a new kind of bomb.
Yes, right. So he said yes, that only a nuclear bomb like that could have achieved this degree of destruction. Yes. Now for that, yes, he did say that, and I think he was sent there to say that. So I actually come to the overall conclusion near the end of the book that the Japanese government was actually in on the scam. They were not voluntarily in on the scam. I strongly suspect that they were coerced and compelled to go along with this, and that this indeed dragged out the war, right? So, I mean, the nuclear bombs are usually said to have shortened the war. I think the very opposite is the case. The Japanese were already ready to give up at the end of 1944 or at the latest in early 1945. But it might just be that the American insistence on staging these nuclear bombings was the very reason for dragging out the war as long as it lasted. Good. Now, the viewers may still be left wondering at this point how strong the evidence against those nuclear bombings really is. So if we simply contrast eyewitness testimonies, and we don't really get certainty from that alone either way, I would say. So even so, we don't have a lot of very early measurements that were very accurate because, as you mentioned, the Japanese measurements, they were just, the records, they were confiscated and apparently destroyed. They have never resurfaced. We do have later measurements of samples that were preserved early. So this atomic physicist, Nishina, he personally or his assistants, they collected some samples from Hiroshima, from the soil in Hiroshima, just a few short days, some 2 or 3 days after the bombing, or 3 or 4 days after the bombing, they preserved these samples. And these samples could be measured later on, right? And there were some measurements. For example, one study which I cite in the book was carried out in 1996, so 50 years after the bombing roundabout. And it finds only a minuscule amount, just barely measurable amount of fission products, which is really quite surprising, right? So if the bomb went off above the city, some 600 meters above the city, that's how the official story goes. And then these samples were taken near the so-called hypocenter, so that means more or less directly beneath that point of the detonation in the air. Then you should expect a really large amount of fission products there, and you should also find a large amount of uranium there, particularly uranium, because in Hiroshima, the bomb is said to have contained of approximately 50 kilograms of fissile uranium. Of that 50 kilograms, only 1 kilogram is said to actually have undergone fission. So the other 49 kilograms should have been dispersed, and a lot of that should also be on the ground in the city. And the amounts that are found on the ground are, again, just extremely tiny, just barely above background. So that means we find neither fission products in appropriate quantity, nor we find the unfissioned uranium in appropriate quantity. So the fallout is a washout. There's really nothing. And it's pretty similar. We have similar, somewhat different set of circumstances in Nagasaki. We actually have one spot in that city, the so-called Nishiyama Reservoir, a small body of water that is some 3 kilometers from the epicenter. And there we have a fairly high level of radioactivity. But in the year 2008, a Japanese research team drilled up a core of sediment from that reservoir, and they sliced up the sediment core into various slices and measured the radioactivity in each of these. They do find at a level of about 4.5 meters down, fairly high level of both plutonium, so the bomb in Nagasaki is supposed to have been a plutonium bomb, but not a uranium one. And they also find cesium in fairly large quantity. However, this slice, right, the level within the sediment at which we find the highest level of radioactivity is about this much, 15 centimeters above the another layer in which we find the soot of the burning city. So somehow the radioactivity and the soot have become separated, or they were separated to begin with, which suggests if we actually look at the time scale of that sediment, right, if we consider that on average the sediment was building up at about 7 centimeters per year, this suggests that the radioactivity was added to the reservoir only some 2 years after the event. So we don't have really unambiguous evidence there either. Now, in connection with this finding, which I just described, it is quite interesting to consider the import of a document, which is the protocol of a meeting of the so-called Interim Committee on Atomic Energy, which was held on May 31st, 1945. So just a few short weeks before the alleged atomic bombings. And present at this meeting were the entire elite of physicists of the Manhattan Project and a smattering of bureaucrats and politicians and soldiers. And at the meeting, the overall chief of physics at the Manhattan Project, Arthur Compton, stated on the record that at this time, the Manhattan Project had gotten nowhere near purifying plutonium. They had no pure plutonium at the time. All they had at this time was just some nuclear fuel that they had put in the reactor, so it had undergone inside the reactor these nuclear fission reactions, and as a byproduct of uranium fission, plutonium is generated. But before you can use it, you actually have to purify it from that fairly complex mixture of radioactive material. And they only had a small amount of even this crude material. And Compton on that occasion estimated that it would take another 2 years to purify plutonium. And then after that, another 1.5 years to actually obtain it in quantity. So we don't know exactly what that means in quantity. It suggests in quantity sufficient for building bombs. But even if we assume that after 2 years, they already had some enough plutonium to build at least one bomb or something or two, even then, we cannot reconcile the import of this protocol with the official story that just only 6 weeks after this meeting, or 8, no, actually a bit more, right? So 10 weeks after this meeting, the first plutonium bomb was detonated in Nagasaki. No, actually, sorry. So 6 weeks is correct because the alleged bomb test in Alamogordo, New Mexico, also used a plutonium bomb, allegedly. So only within 6 weeks of this meeting, the first bomb is supposed to have been detonated, which simply cannot be true. On the other hand, the time estimate given by Compton at this meeting really agrees very well with the findings on the ground in Nagasaki. So it does suggest that indeed, approximately 2 years after this meeting, they had purified at least enough plutonium to fake the fallout in Nagasaki.
Well, I think that even people that follow the official narrative will have noticed in this narrative the enormous time pressure that apparently the Manhattan Project managers put on their staff, and that was felt by their staff. So even the movie that is called that is mostly watched by people interested in this project. This is of course Little Boy and Fat Man. It states the difficulty explicitly throughout the movie and the miraculous speed by which the final phase was achieved. So this fits in, even in the official narrative, the time pressure element is present. I'd like to remind the audience here that although Dr. Palmer is kind enough here to give us his exposition in layman's terms. The book is full of scientific proof. So let me just here elaborate a little bit on the kilo count that you gave for the Hiroshima bomb. So 50 kilos of U-235, 235, of which 1 kilo fissioned. This would have left us with a question of 49 kilos missing uranium. Obviously, this material should have been enriched to 80%, which is an enormous deviation from the natural background radiation that we find everywhere in the world. So the discrepancy between the two should have been immediately noticed in any kind of measurement that took place later on in the Hiroshima site. So this is done by a thing called isotope measurement, done through mass spectrometry, and it reveals that the ratio uranium 235, 238, which is vital for evidence of a nuclear explosion in Hiroshima. This ratio is almost the natural background radiation. There's just very slight deviation here. So we could say this is an incontrovertible proof, scientific proof, that no such detonation of a uranium bomb took place over Hiroshima at that time. There are other explanations for the slight discrepancies. We'll go into that. Going back to the setting in which this whole episode took place, these are so-called atomic bombings. I'd like to remind the audience of the events preceding it, the war events, the war strategy pursued by the Anglo-Saxon powers, especially America, on the Axis powers that were still fighting both in the spring of 45, early spring and winter. We find fire bombings. So fire bombings at Dresden, even the most conservative estimates put a number of killed at 80,000 in Dresden by a firestorm that was created by carpet bombing of a very specific type. This feat was repeated over Tokyo just a few weeks later, with a larger number of deaths, probably at least 100,000. And these numbers do not deviate very spectacularly from the number of deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were something like 100,000 or 150,000 for Hiroshima, and about half of that perhaps for Nagasaki. So it is not like there is an enormous difference in the kill ratio. It is just the fact that these last two bombings are supposed to be atomic bombings, so achieved by a single bomb. This is the great difference. The strategy, the larger war strategy that was in place, resulted in the burning and destruction of cities already before the atomic bombings, which is why de Seversky says that he was not surprised at all by the look of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I will quote a short sentence from this report by Seversky. He said, "I was keyed up for my first view of an atom-bombed city, prepared for the radically new sights suggested by the exciting descriptions I had read and heard. But to my utter astonishment, Hiroshima from the air looked exactly like all other burnt-out cities that I had observed." Now, coming to the physical evidence on people. So, because you are also a medical doctor, it is important to explain the kind of injuries and the kind of sicknesses that were coped with by the Hiroshima survivors, and the injury that was noted on the short-time survivors just after the bombings. This is, of course, a big part of the evidence in the book as well. It is a very important aspect. So you're talking here about an alternative scenario in which mustard gas and napalm were used to create an effect of quite spectacular order of magnitude, and with results on the human body that mimic or partially overlap with those supposed of a nuclear explosion. Can you go into some more detail on these two aspects? So the mustard gas hypothesis and the napalm hypothesis. To what degree do they overlap with the injuries and trauma expected from an atomic explosion, and to what degree do they differ?
Okay. Yeah. So the mustard gas agent, that's actually the one I hit upon the first because I was struck by the many reports on supposed radiation sickness from victims in Hiroshima. And there are indeed many case reports and statistics that indicate symptoms, diseases that can be caused by radiation. That is quite clear. So we have people dying simply because their bone marrow had been destroyed, right? So the bone marrow is the place in the body where all your blood cells originate, the red ones, the white ones, and the blood platelets, the platelets are important for blood clotting. So obviously you cannot live with any of them, but the red blood cells, they have a lifetime of about 4 months. So even if you stop building red blood cells today, you can still go on the ones that you already have for a couple of months before things become critical. The lifespan of white blood cells is much shorter. And the lymphocytes in particular, that's one subtype of the white blood cells, they have a very high radiation sensitivity. They're very susceptible to destruction by radiation. And the white blood cells are your immune system, essentially, right? The entire immune system depends on your white blood cells. So if the white blood cells are destroyed, or if the bone marrow is prevented from regenerating your white blood cells, then your immune system will crumble, will crash, and you will be susceptible to infections, right? So one effect of radiation sickness, typically setting in after a couple of days or weeks, is the susceptibility to all kinds of infections. And then finally, you have the blood platelets. They have a fairly short duration, just a week or two, something like that. And if the regeneration of the platelet stops, then after that time, after some 10 to 14 days, you will develop bleeding. So you will have internal bleeding, you'll bleed into the skin and this kind of thing. And I mean, all of these early signs of radiation sickness were observed in victims in Hiroshima, really suggesting strongly that that some kind of nuclear detonation had happened. Now, if no nuclear detonation had happened, then what could possibly have caused these things? And you know that the same signs, the same kind of side effects that you see with strong radiation treatment, you can also observe with chemotherapy, right? Cancer chemotherapy, the traditional type of cytotoxic cancer chemotherapy, produces damage to the bone marrow. It also produces hair loss, just as radiation does. And the similarity of the effect of mustard gas and radiation was already known since 1919. So that was the earliest paper I found that described this similarity. And indeed, mustard gas became the granddaddy, so to speak, of the early agents that were used for cancer chemotherapy. One very similar compound is nitrogen mustard. So just a single atom is replaced, a sulfur atom is replaced by a nitrogen atom, but the mode of action of these two agents is the very same one. And nitrogen mustard was used quite widely for a good while for cancer and leukemia chemotherapy. But so while radiation and mustard gas are similar in their effects on bone marrow and hair follicles and a couple of other organ systems, there are also differences. Radiation, ionizing radiation, X-rays, gamma rays, even neutron rays, they come diffusely at you from any direction and they go through you, and part of that energy gets absorbed in your body and damages it in a very diffuse way. But mustard gas actually has to get into your body across some barrier. It can go across the skin, which gets damaged in the process, or it can go through the lungs. You can inhale it, right? Mustard gas is used. I mean, it's actually at room temperature. It's an oily fluid, but it evaporate slowly over time, and the fumes, when inhaled, they damage you, and they also damage your lungs in particular. And we do find lung damage, pronounced lung damage, in the acute stage, very briefly in the early victims, right? And those who succumbed early to the exposure of whatever it was that was released in the two cities, we find lung damage in a very pronounced way with these people. And you would not expect this with radiation. Any dose of radiation that is survivable at all, that doesn't kill you within a couple of days, will not do pronounced damage to your lungs. It could do some long-term damage to your lungs, such as lung fibrosis and so on, but you will not suffer acutely from radiation damage to your lung. You will suffer very acutely from exposure to mustard gas, and that's what we see on the ground. We see multiple signs. We see people. Okay, so that's one sign, the lung damage. And the other sign is when the mustard gas gets into your blood circulation, it causes your blood vessels to become leaky. You get what's called a capillary leak syndrome. So the fluid inside your blood vessels will seep freely out of the blood vessels into the tissues. That means, on the one hand, your blood volume drops. That gives you actually a strong feeling of thirst. And at the same time, your tissues swell up. You drink more, the fluid leaks out again, you swell up some more. So this is the sort of a vicious cycle in capillary leak syndrome. As long as the circulation is leaky, you will drink and swell up, and so on. And this is also found in the eyewitness testimony from both cities. People, right, typically fairly soon they died, but before they died, these people had actually congregated around any kind of puddle or creek and just simply rested there, and they had drunk the water, and they were just simply swelled up. At the same time, their skin was bluish. That was, again, the lung damage, right? So if the lungs are damaged, then you get blue, right, because you don't get oxygen. So we have among the victims who succumbed early on, we have clear signs of capillary leak syndrome and lung damage, which is quite clearly compatible with mustard gas. We also have the skin lesions, right? The mustard gas and similar compounds, they are called vesicants because they cause the skin to form blisters. And these victims, they also had blistering skin, skin that just easily stripped off if the bodies were if people handled the bodies, right? When people handled the bodies, they noticed that the skin would slip off. So that is also a typical sign of mustard gas poisoning. So the radiation cannot explain these additional symptoms, but they fit perfectly with mustard gas poisoning. Now, the napalm was used also in fire bombings in other cities. But I suspect, cannot prove it, but I suspect it was deployed in a different way. In other cities, the napalm bombs, right? So napalm, to explain what it is, it's essentially just petrol, which has been turned into a sticky gel by adding some suitable thickeners. And these can be of various kinds, can be polymers, can be some sort of metal soaps, right? So metal salts or fatty acids. The essential point is this stuff burns and develops intense heat, and it just, when it is ignited and spreads through a detonation, it just simply flies through the air in the form of burning balls of jelly, of petrol jelly, and it just sticks anywhere, and wherever it hits, it causes an intense burn. Okay.
If
Now,
if I
yeah,
understand correctly, your
yeah,
thesis is that the explosion of the napalm normally in the earlier fire bombings took place at ground level, but that in
that's right.
Hiroshima
Yes,
it took place at a higher level. Is that correct? And that also explains
that is
the visual effects,
that's
right?
That's what I suspect. From eyewitness testimony, it appears that indeed in Hiroshima, the napalm bombs were actually detonated high up in the air, several hundred meters, and then these burning balls right? They were just simply falling to the ground. So there are some eyewitnesses describe this as lava falling from the sky, right? So this is what they describe. And apparently this lava fell out of these big mushroom clouds, right? So I mean, we have gotten used to associate atomic detonations with mushroom clouds, but the question really is, you have to stop and think why. Why would a nuclear detonation form any cloud at all? It actually shouldn't form any cloud. You just have a bit of metal, be it plutonium or uranium, and now you have an intense, you have a nuclear detonation inside. So essentially what you have is an intense release of heat, but there is nothing that could actually provide smoke particles. There's no water vapor or something like that. So what should this mushroom cloud actually consist of? There should be no cloud. There should just be a flash, but no cloud. But I suspect, and also good. So then that's one point about the cloud. Another point is some people, and even the New York Times, as of 2016, has claimed that the mushroom clouds were, after all, not really caused by the nuclear bombs, but that they were just simply the smoke plumes of the burning cities. That, however, does not really agree with eyewitness testimony, because multiple eyewitnesses describe in very good agreement with each other that these clouds formed very early on the attack, just within the first minute or so. You had these big smoke clouds. So these smoke clouds must have been some sort of special purpose fireworks. What also supports that is that the eyewitnesses, the Japanese eyewitnesses, actually describe particularly the cloud at Hiroshima as colorful. Multiple colors were swirling in the sky. I mean, even if you can somehow contrive a way that a nuclear detonation should generate some kind of cloud at all, I mean, would it be colorful? No, it would not be colorful. This is just simply some kind of party trick that they set off there. And I think that these smoke clouds, these so-called atomic clouds, they were part of the performance that served to simply cloud over the sky, so to hide
Yes,
the
bombings.
airplanes,
Yeah.
to hide the airplanes that would actually then deliver the mustard gas and the napalm and other things from the sky. Okay.
What I understand is that such a effect, such a flash effect, which by the way did
Yeah.
not cause fatal retina damage as it should have for
Yes.
people looking straight into it if it was an atomic explosion. Rather, it was described by many without retina damage, looking into it as a,
Yes.
a moving flash, right? A flash that
Right. Yeah.
moved through time. And
Yeah.
you suggest in the book that it can be caused by a combination of magnesium and aluminum, for example, right? In the initial
Yeah. Yeah.
phases.
But
Yes, I understood.
but I really haven't found any specific evidence. This is really speculation. What devices exactly
Yes,
were used to set off that flash? I really can only. I mean, there were some photo flash bombs that might have been suitable,
right.
right? So apparently, actually, my father also described that sort of thing. He was with the Flak in Germany in the wartime. He also describes the Americans dropping photo flash bombs from the sky to illuminate the bombing at target area. So it might have been something like this. But whatever it was certainly there because the eyewitnesses described the flash. But as you say, many eyewitnesses looked into the flash and they did not have their retinas burned. So the flash shouldn't have been fatal as such, but it should have caused irreversible damage to the retina. And we actually do have an early report by an American ophthalmologist. He, for some reason, was already admitted to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the beginning of September, so at a similar time as was Seversky. And he personally examined the eyes of several hundred survivors, and he described not a single case of retinal burn. And the entire medical literature, right? Since these lesions should have been irreversible, also at later times, these patients should have been discovered. There is not a single case from Hiroshima or Nagasaki that describes this sort of burn to the retina.
Well, without
Now,
yeah, sorry.
sorry, one more note on the flash burns, right? So if indeed you were supposedly hit by a nuclear flash, then all your skin should be burned fairly homogeneously. All your exposed skin should be fairly evenly burned, right? But what we see in the survivors of the two bombings is that the burns are very spotty and patchy, have very irregular outlines. So you have very sharp transition from a heavily burnt area to a healthy skin area. And that fits much better with the exposure to napalm. And indeed, there was one paper by one Japanese and one American physician, Block and Suzuki, from 1948, that describes exactly that these so-called, the alleged flash burns from the two cities are clinically not to be distinguished from actual acknowledged napalm burns as they are found in survivors of the Tokyo bombing.
Well, this is just a reminder, audience, that we're here touching just on a few aspects and a few points concerning the medical effects. So people that want to go into the details would have to look at the book and investigate it. I believe that we do not have to dishonor the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by talking about an alternative thesis, which is at least as horrible as the atomic bomb thesis, because that's what it is. We are talking here about a weapon of satanic force, even although it was achieved probably by completely different means than atomic bombing. And facts that are truly horrifying. So we should not forget to mention here that mustard gas was at that time illegal. It was an illegal substance. It was forbidden by international conventions for use against military, let alone civilians. Your thesis, because you do develop an alternative thesis, has quite big overlaps with the thesis of a Japanese colleague of yours, Nakatani. So, if I read it correctly, he is saying that there could have been a non-nuclear pyrotechnical scenario, accounting exactly for the pyrotechnics of the clouds, involving photoflash bombs for a less than atomic level intensity flash, followed by separate airburst bombs, which also account for spread bangs instead of one gigantic bang, and followed by dispersal of reactor waste at a later stage to create some kind of evidence of fallout, probably very localized. And the bulk of the bombing being made up of exactly what we are here talking about: mustard gas to fake radiation sickness, and napalm to create thermal damage. So Nakatani, he has a very large, he has a quite comprehensive thesis on.
No, that's actually not the case. So he came up with the idea of the photo flash bombs, but he says otherwise, that the cities were essentially destroyed by conventional firebombing. So the entire thesis of mustard gas is not to be found in his book. So
not in his book. Okay, then I
no, it's not
misunderstood
in
that.
his book. No.
It is good that you corrected that.
In other point, he is probably not Japanese. I mean, I think this is just a Japanese pen name, but from the entire writing style of that book, I strongly suspect that the author is indeed American. But I do think the book has merit. Nakatani claims to have conducted personally computer simulations using the parameters, right? The properties of both uranium and plutonium that are nowadays known with much greater accuracy than they used to be known then. And his calculations allegedly yielded the result that the bomb designs the claimed bomb designs of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs could never have worked. And even so, he does not show his calculations. He does describe them in outline, let's say. So I think he gives some hints. So if somebody with the proper expertise and interest wants to actually carry out such calculations themselves, I think it would be very valuable. And he could start by looking at Nakatani's description of his own setup.
Then we go, I think, best in this podcast to one of the chapters that people will find probably very interesting. Non-scientists will find this a very interesting chapter. That is the chapter 13, how it was done. So how this alternative scenario was given form. And this is, you start off in this chapter by quoting Sun Tzu. You say, when using forces, our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe that we are far away. So you're here talking about the war strategy of deception, as the Russians call it, maskirovka. So you hide your intentions and you, in a very smart way, you are making your enemy work for you. And I think that is exactly one of the thesis of chapter 13. In any case, let's start out with some facts. So the first Japanese radio broadcast you mentioned in your book on the subject described the events at Hiroshima as follows. I think it's worthwhile quoting it. A small number of B-29s penetrated into the Hiroshima city a little after 8 a.m. This is from the Japanese radio. Yesterday morning, and dropped a small number of bombs. A small number of bombs, plural. As a result, a considerable number of homes were reduced to ashes and fires broke out in various parts of the city. To this new type of bomb are attached parachutes, and it appears as if these new bombs exploded in the air. Investigations are now being made with regard to the effectiveness of this bomb, which should not be regarded as slight. So this is from a day later, Japanese radio. Then, another quote I think we should make here. It is again from your book. The formal protest that the Japanese lodged against the United States through the Swiss embassy on the 12th of August, that's before the Japanese surrender. Again, note the use of the word plural for bombs. In the protest note, they write, on August 6, 1945, American airplanes released on the residential district of the town of Hiroshima bombs of a new type. Bombs, plural. Killing and injuring in 1 second a large number of civilians and destroying a great part of the town. They now use this new bomb, having an uncontrollable and cruel effect much greater than any other arms or projectiles ever used to date. This constitutes a new crime against humanity and civilization. So there are some reports here by the Japanese, and they stick out in their contrast to the narrative that has been upheld enthusiastically, we might add, by the Japanese government, representing the victims, supposedly, of the bombing. And this brings us to a very painful point, which I actually found the most shocking part of your book. And that is the fact, that is the presupposition of your book, that the Japanese government probably colluded in the bombings and their cover-up. Working for the Americans in the sense that they confirmed the atomic explosion narrative. Can you tell us something about that? How was your first lead into that very shocking allegation? How did you come up with that? I found it the most shocking part of your book, to be honest.
Well, I mean, we have discussed the evidence, which is really simple and straightforward enough. We have this famous Japanese atomic scientist, Joshua Nishina, who was on the ground in Hiroshima already just a few days after the bombing. And he personally collected those samples that contained almost no fallout. So he must have known that the idea that a proper nuclear detonation happened there was really not correct, right? So the evidence was clear. Then we have statements by a Japanese general. He actually had been a former Minister of Defense. He happened to be stationed in Hiroshima. Hiroshima was a fairly large base of the Japanese military. And he said that he didn't buy the story, essentially, that there was one big bomb. The destruction simply didn't add up. The signs of destruction didn't add up. And then another point is that the Japanese themselves, they were quite familiar with mustard gas. They had been producing mustard gas at a facility which was actually also fairly close to Hiroshima, some 50 kilometers away. So you would actually have some Japanese specialists, and you had the soldiers who were also well trained in chemical warfare. All of them were on the ground. There were quite a few soldiers in the city. Many were killed, others survived. And these soldiers, they would have known what they had been dealing with. There were rumors actually flying through the city early on that some kind of poison gas had been released. And these rumors must have been squashed later on with kind of fairy tales that the population was given. So it was quite clear that there was plenty of evidence. And I mean, the Japanese government had the advice of military and scientific experts, and they could not have been deceived by this sort of stage play. So they had to know what really happened. And then the choice is really diminished. So they were not deceived. This is clear. So then it really comes down to the question, were they surprised and decided for some reason of their own to go along with the deception, or were they forced to collude in staging the bombings? And on balance, I'm inclined to think that they were indeed forced to collude in staging the bombings. They did not want to do this, and I think that this is actually a fairly natural explanation for the fact that the war dragged out as long as it did. The Japanese knew they were defeated, and they were trying to get peace negotiations going as early as late 44. So almost a year before the war actually formally ended, did they actually sue for peace, or they tried to sue for peace, and they didn't get anywhere. I think that it might have looked for a while as if peace could be had already in spring, right? And this was the general staff of the United States. They were aware of the Japanese peace feelers, and they advised President Truman to just simply grant the Japanese their request of preserving their own statehood and their emperor and so on, and just simply leave it at that, right? The Japanese would be driven out. They would give up all conquered territory that they still had at the time. They were still in China, for example. They were still clinging to a couple of islands in the Pacific, but they would give it all up. They would just simply retreat to their own home islands and become more or less a vassal of the United States. They were quite resigned to that outcome of the war. So that is essentially what happened in 1945. So then, if what the Americans actually granted the Japanese in the event is the same essentially what the Japanese asked for half a year or a year earlier, then why drag out the war? So there must have been some motive for that. And I think that motive was to browbeat the Japanese into colluding and staging these bombings, these atomic bombings, these fake atomic bombings. I think that was the key driver for that.
I think that you here bring up a very good document as well in your book. That is the Hoover Memorandum. It's largely overlooked by historians. Penned by former President Hoover, advising the then President Roosevelt, no, he was already dead, Truman, in May 45 to make peace with the Japanese on the basis of the feelers that had been put out. So this makes sense that for some time the war apparently was dragged on purpose. There might be all kinds of military thinking behind it. I mean, I do know that the Japanese fleet, for example, was finally only sunk completely in July, so that took some time. There may have been this kind of considerations, but in any case, the big question, of course, is if the Japanese colluded, to what extent did that involve an element of let's say, preserving face. So an atomic bomb is, of course, something that is a new weapon that people can use as a statement saying, look, there's something new that the enemy has that we never could cope with. So that might have been a face-saving element in a certain sense. On the other hand, the degree of cynicism that is involved in it, it would be truly shocking. So
Yeah.
what I found very
I th-
interesting is a thesis that you put on that later actually the facts on the ground they required the two different narratives to be given, one to the outside world and one to Japan. So you are pointing out in your chapter that um, Japan was de facto controlled afterwards by America completely. All communications were controlled. So there could be one story for internal use in Japan and one for outer use. I found interesting the story for internal use. So the suggestion, for example, that there was an atom gas bomb, right? The hyphened atom
yes,
gas
yes,
bomb.
yes,
Can you tell us
yes.
something more about that? What was the perception in Japan itself, among the Japanese scientific community and among the people that experienced it or they were very closely linked to the events? What was the view in Japan current in the years following the
Yeah. So I already mentioned that shortly after the bombings, that there were rumors flying through the cities that indeed these bombings had been carried out with poison gas. Many people had perceived it for themselves, so it would have been impossible, I think, to persuade these people that they had seen ghosts and that there was no poison gas around. So what they were told instead was that the atomic bombs in some form had caused the formation of poison gas. And you see this reflected both in scientific writings, and you see it also in, interestingly, particularly plain language in the witness testimony of Japanese school children whose testimony was collected by a Japanese teacher and was translated. And this book has something like about 100, I think a bit more than 100 testimonies from as many children. And 13 of them very explicitly mention that their relatives died because they had inhaled poison gas and so on, or they themselves suffered hair loss because they had inhaled poison gas from the atomic bomb and this sort of thing. And there is also, I found two scientific articles or book chapters that also suggest the existence of some sort of atomic bomb gas, which it's totally implausible. There simply is no mechanism by which radioactivity of any kind leads to the formation of a chemical poison. It just doesn't happen. I mean, the radiation itself, the radioactive substance itself can be poisonous, but it doesn't bring about any kind of synthesis of organic molecules such as mustard gas or whatever. It just simply does not work that way. So, and I think that this story, it may be a bit surprising that it even was accepted in Japan. That has probably something to do with the trauma. I think the psychological trauma prevents people from thinking critically. And I think that this is so it could work in Japan, but it probably would not have worked worldwide. So therefore, I think it was important to not have the story spread outside of Japan, and hence the very strict censorship. It was really breached only once, to my knowledge. We have the Australian journalist Wilfred Burchett, who was another early visitor to Hiroshima. He actually had to sneak into the city. He was in Japan at the time, but Hiroshima was off limits for civilians, and he needed to use all his scheming and cunning to actually get into the city. And after he had been there, to get his reports out of the city and spread to the newspaper, the relay to the newspaper that he was working for at the time. And he also clearly mentions that he noticed a sulfuric smell in the city. And he was told by the Japanese he was speaking to that this was the poisonous gas that was still emanating from the radiation-soaked soil, right? So it really seems that already at this early stage, the Japanese had been given a bullshit story about the effects of the radiation and the causation of the poisonous gas by radioactivity. So that was the deceptive story that was told in Japan itself.
So you already talked about the censorship. I'd like to quote another sentence from your book. And you're saying here, we can therefore conclude that censorship was not intended to protect the sensibilities of the American people or the reputation of their government. It was not the American people's feelings in the matter that were to be suppressed, but rather their understanding of the facts. And here, of course, we breach to the last chapter, chapter 14, dedicated to the question why it was done. So, following the thesis that there were no atomic bombings, which I consider sufficiently proved till disproved, and I don't think that's feasible. In any case, let's assume everything that we have heard so far is correct, more or less, and that the atomic bombings were no atomic bombings, but rather a new combination of bombing assets staged to resemble an atomic bombing. Then there's the big question, why was it done the way it was? So you make short shrift in your book, very correctly in my view, because any historian familiar with the facts will immediately recognize the correctness of your analysis, namely that it was not atomic bombs that made Japan surrender. Japan was already willing to surrender and offered to do so, in fact, under certain minimal conditions. It was also not meant to intimidate Stalin, who was at Potsdam suitably unimpressed by the American statement when told that is a very famous event that really took place. And that leaves us with only very few options. It leaves us with very few options as to the final motivation. You do make some suggestions, and you are careful to point out that these suggestions have nothing to do with the central thesis of your book, so they might be disregarded, still leaving intact the thesis of your book. In any case, I would like to ask at least one question about that. You wrote in your book the following. We propose that the atomic bombings, atomic between brackets, were acts of state terror directed at the international general public to create a general fear of impending nuclear war, which should induce the people of the world to voluntarily surrender their national sovereignty and submit to a world government, which of course fits in with the then very important notion of the United Nations, which was set up that summer, which was activated that summer. And of course, we are reading here echoes of some post-conspiracy theories, world government, and a new world order, which we have also been confronted with in rhetoric in the 1990s and later. And we are seeing them in combination with a very large, let's say, deception. If 9/11 was a deception and it created the war on terror and was an instrument to create a new world order, then we could argue that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings were a failed effort at creating such a new world order. This is all pure speculation, but I'd just like perhaps you to elaborate a little bit on this theme. Because you came up with this sentence, I would like you to ask to elaborate a bit on it.
Yeah, in a sense, it is by default, right? I mean, it cannot really have been directed at any kind of competent state actor, right? Stalin certainly wasn't deceived. I mean, we also know the story about the atomic spies in the United States who allegedly kept Stalin apprised of anything and everything that was going on inside the Manhattan Project. If indeed the Manhattan Project had not succeeded at producing an atomic bomb, then Stalin would have been in on it. And we actually have proof that the Manhattan Project did not pass on any useful information on how to obtain nuclear fuel, because Stalin actually initiated, or the Russians initiated after the war, their own program for enriching plutonium. And the ironic fact is they actually succeeded. They captured a German nuclear physicist, Max Steenbeck, and Max Steenbeck in turn recruited a couple of prisoners from German and Austrian POW camps inside the USSR, and together with his team, he developed the first workable method for enriching uranium, and this is the gas centrifuge, which remains in use until today. So the Russians themselves in the late 40s and early 1950s developed a methodology that then, once these people were actually released after Stalin's death back into Germany, spread from Germany, from Russia to Germany to the United States, and only then did the Americans become able to enrich uranium. Okay, but that leads away again from the political theme. So Stalin certainly knew that there was nothing to the atomic bombs, so he couldn't have been impressed. And I don't think anybody in America would be naive enough to believe that they could impress Stalin that way, with the possible exception of Truman. It almost seems that Truman's performance at Potsdam suggests that he himself was deceived. So Truman was deceived about the atomic bombs, and he tried to impress Stalin, who was not deceived. So it's a pretty ironic situation, really. Okay, so if Stalin wasn't to be impressed, then who else? It could really only be the general public. And we also have to consider that the general public was shortly after bombarded with the atomic scare propaganda, right? We mentioned earlier on Alexander de Seversky, who wrote up his report about his impressions from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when he was back in North America, he was totally disbelieved, and he was attacked in the media and this kind of thing. He was just simply discredited and so on. People simply wouldn't believe what he had to say, because in the meantime, shortly after the war, they had already been exposed to all the scare propaganda. I also found a nice booklet, propaganda booklet, with the beautiful title "One World or None," which was published as early as 1946. And in this book, the entire purpose of this book is to whip up a nuclear scare, right? So one of the physicists who co-wrote this book, Philip Morrison, he wrote a fictitious tale about a nuclear attack on New York and the kind of destruction that would have to be expected in that case. And he even gives a cameo appearance in this fictional tale to Alexander de Seversky. So he imagines that Alexander de Seversky was present at his attack in New York and got killed in the process. So it's a very nice touch on which de Seversky himself comments in his own book. So de Seversky was apparently a sturdy character who was not really perturbed very much by the public attacks on him. But nevertheless, it's an impressive touch. And we also have this book co-written by all the luminaries from the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer himself, even Einstein is among the co-authors, right? So we have all these physical luminaries that had allegedly made the success of the Manhattan Project possible, and they all pitched in with their nuclear scare propaganda, with their horror tales, and all of them were really trying to persuade the public that it's time for a world government. It is very explicit. It's made very explicit in this book. So I don't really have to invent. This purpose. It is really stated fairly plain. It is made quite plain. So if we simply take this propaganda pitch together with my conclusion that the atomic bombings were indeed staged, I think then we also come fairly easily to the conclusion which I state in my final chapter.
And this brings us to the context of your work. So I wonder about this because I must admit, myself, I have never run into Hiroshima denial. I have run into Holocaust denial, but not into Hiroshima denial. Of course, the second version, Hiroshima denial, is not punishable under any law in any jurisdiction. You
Not
can
yet.
freely, you can not yet. You can freely talk about it as we are doing here
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder about something. To what extent is Hiroshima denial a fact? How widespread is it? What is your, I mean, you are one of the world specialists on this topic. You have encountered your colleagues, you have confronted the public with this, with your thesis. What is your impression? How far widespread is the knowledge of the facts as you present them, especially in Japan itself, which was, after all, the victim of this giant hoax? What is your impression about the alternative vision as you set out? How widespread and how acceptable is it now, 80 years after the events?
I think it is not widespread at all. I think that, for example, Holocaust denial has found a much larger acceptance than Hiroshima denial so far. I think one also has to consider that there have been lots of revisionist scholars who have analyzed the evidence on the alleged Holocaust. And the evidence is, I think it's more widespread, it's quite accessible. It was a larger community of these revisionist scholars who have spread that message, and they have been at it for several decades. And I think, while I think Holocaust, excuse me, but I think that the denial of the atomic bombings is a more recent development. So I think it's still early days. It's still early days, which is why I put in such an effort. I really tried to address the evidence in a comprehensive way. I tried to try to close all escape hatches, all backdoors and this kind of thing in order to evade the evidence. I wanted to address everything as far as I could. And it was, if I may say so, it was a fairly good match to my background. So I had already been interested in nuclear energy in my youth, and I had become interested in radiation biology as part of my medical curriculum and so on. So that was my interests were a fairly good match to the different types of evidence I encountered in this context.
Well, as you mentioned, I cannot but concur from a non-specialist point of view. I think you did close all the escape hatches around your thesis. I do believe that you have quite conclusively proven yours, and but that raises a question. To what extent were you countermanded? To what extent did you ever receive any substantial counter elements from counter questions or counter propositions from so-called mainstream scientists, people that could stand on an equal footing with you? To what extent have you ever encountered substantial arguments against your thesis?
I have not really encountered substantial counter arguments. I have mostly encountered refusal to engage with the evidence. And with one quite remarkable exception, I actually had a good interaction with a physicist whom I approached. So this physicist had actually made the atomic bombings or the atomic bombs and their supposed physical workings the focus of his own study. Okay, so he was a professor at some smaller college in somewhere in the United States. And he has written several books about the topic. So I actually contacted him with some specialist questions. I mean, I'm not a physicist myself, so I needed some kind of confirmation. And he actually was kind enough to review my entire chapter 3 on fallout. He reviewed it all and he criticized some of it. He made some corrections to it, for which I'm very grateful. And I asked him then, after he had read it, okay, what do you think of it? Can you explain it? How do you reconcile it? How do you reconcile these findings with your own conviction that these bombings were real? And he said, I can't. but I still stick. I still stick, as he was honest enough he was kind enough to engage, to review all this work, to give explanations, was really very friendly, very kind, but he could not reconcile the findings to which I drew his attention with the thesis that indeed nuclear detonations happened. He could acknowledge freely he couldn't explain it, but he still persevered with his conviction.
So that is actually the first engagement of a normal, regular scientific peer conference, peer review procedure, right? Somebody criticizes you, then you answer again, then you ask a third opinion, and so on. This process, there was a little start of that, but it did not progress, which can indicate either you just blew them out of the water and you're completely correct, or you're completely insane. This is the two possibilities, which of course many COVID commentators, they have been subjected to the same. I would say the Japanese strategy of mokusatsu, yes, kill by silence, right? We cannot disprove the argument, so we are just going to ignore it. On the other hand, there is one method that I have found can be quite useful in still producing some kind of scientific argument, and that is to ask the person who has the thesis himself, how can we disprove it? Or if that's not possible, where are the weaknesses in your own research? Or, put it more politely, what do you think are still questions that you would like have answered on this topic?
So this is what you're asking me now?
Kind of. Like, where do you think are still questions that are worth researching, things that you would personally be interested in having contributed to this whole issue, to this whole thesis? What would you like to have as additional input on it?
Well, I mean, you already mentioned one important question early on, which I did not address in my book, and this is, are nuclear weapons possible at all? Have they been developed in the meantime, or are they really impossible on principle? And I have not come to a firm conclusion, but I do say that I lean towards nuclear weapons really not existing at all. That is, I find that more plausible at this point, because they have never been used in warfare, right? I mean, chemical weapons exist and have been used. Biological weapons have been used, even though not as frequently as have been chemical weapons. The only exceptions are the nuclear weapons, and this is certainly not for some sort of moral inhibitions or anything like that, or ethical reasons. I mean, I think we can conclude from the experience of the 20th century that there are very few inhibitions we can rely on to protect us from any kind of abuse. So that is one important reason, and but that really leads the way. And I think that the one reason, there are several reasons for which I stayed away from it. Firstly is I am not a physicist, and there would be little medical evidence as long as we are simply talking about atomic tests. So the sort of evidence there is, I think, would be a very worthwhile field of study for somebody with a solid background in nuclear physics or nuclear chemistry. I think these people should take it up, and not me as a medical doctor. Then another point, the medical evidence, much of the medical evidence clearly has been suppressed. I think that there is one foundation, they call themselves now the Radiation Effects Research Foundations. They used to be called ABCC, for Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. This is an outfit that is jointly funded and run by the governments of the US and of Japan. It is situated in Japan. And I think they are sitting on information, if they haven't already destroyed it, the medical records of the early victims. What they have published is junk, honestly. They have published lots of junk literature. A few useful studies, even though they are very incomplete in their the scope of the data they document. But the clinical medical information is just that the statistics they publish on, it is just total garbage, right? I mean, they collect statistics on heart disease or lung disease and this sort of, I mean, what do you do with it? You cannot reason about this sort of information. It's not possible. I mean, you can die of lung disease because your heart gives out, because then you have a lung edema, then you get a pneumonia, so then you might be a lung disease dead, because even so ultimately it's your heart. Can be the other way around. You can have an obstructive lung disease, and this actually shoots your heart to pieces, and then you die of a heart disease. So you cannot really work with any of these data. It's not possible. And I think this kind of information is deliberately suppressed, particularly from the very early years, right, the late 40s. And in those days, I think you would have seen the most characteristic types of disease that would point the most unambiguously to poison gas as opposed to radiation. So I think I would like to see more of that medical evidence released. And then obviously there must be lots of secrets still being stored in the vaults of the Pentagon or wherever. I mean, where the details are kept, the information, the files are kept on how the entire operation was really carried out. There's one more incident actually that is also interesting in this connection. You may have heard of the sinking of the Indianapolis, the US
Yes,
cruiser
yes.
that is supposed to have been the ship that conveyed the bomb used
Plutonium, yes,
in
plutonium.
yes, Titanium, exactly, right, in the Northern Marianas. So from the US West Coast to Tinian. Then it sailed on from Tinian first to Guam, and from Guam it was supposed to sail to Manila. And the ship was sunk about halfway by a Japanese submarine. And this Japanese submarine seems to simply have been lying there in ambush and waiting for this ship. And the ship apparently still mentioned to send off an SOS signal, which was allegedly not received. And the ship was failed to show up in time. It should have been in the Philippines a day later or two after it was sunk, and it didn't show up. And allegedly, this non-appearance was overlooked, and nobody followed up on it. And some minor port officer was later on reprimanded for it, and this kind of thing. The of the crew of something like 1,100 people, some 800 people initially managed to get off the wreck and into the water. And then because they were left floating about there for a couple of days, about 2/3 of them actually were eaten by sharks or succumbed otherwise. And so this is also some sort of a cover-up story, and the kind of the way this was dealt with in the U.S. military court system is totally parallel, totally similar to the way the Hawaiian officers who were on which the failure to prevent Pearl Harbor was blamed. They were dealt with in exactly the same way. And it is the same kind of cover up, right? So also the captain of the ship of the Indianapolis, he had not been given any escort. He had not been given the information that just a few short days before another US ship had been sunk by a Japanese submarine in the same waters and so on. So he was not warned of any of it. He was given no protection, no information. All he was given was the blame afterwards for the sinking of the ship.
Well, any military historian notices the anomaly of the sinking of the Indianapolis. So the Japanese
Yes.
sinking capital ships towards the end of the war, enemy capital ships,
Hmm.
American capital ships
Yes.
towards the end of the war,
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
extremely rare.
Yes.
Very few
Yes.
attacks were successful, but this one stands out as a blip. In any case,
Yes.
your remark takes away another illusion from our viewers, namely that the movie Jaws is worth watching because, of course, there the theme of the Indianapolis sinking and performing a heroic task and being punished for being successful, the punishment here can very well be put on the account of the American government itself. In this case, it's a very
Yes.
shocking thing,
Well,
as shocking
well,
as the Japanese collusion in
yes,
the staging
but
of these events.
and I'm just wondering, I mean, it is very hard to figure out or to be sure of any kind of reason for this kind of staged event, right? I mean, the Indianapolis was already sunk a week before Hiroshima happened. So they were sunk before the bombing. So it was not in that sense a punishment. And what I suspected is it was part of, I mean, my suspicion is the Japanese were coerced into sacrificing their own people. And they may have demanded, for whatever reason, that the Americans sacrifice some of theirs in turn. And I think this was the Indianapolis. I think that both Hiroshima and the Indianapolis were, in a way, in a sense, part of the same human sacrifice.
Well, we will have to wrap up this very interesting interview. Of course, it is obvious with hindsight to look at events through a conspiracy glasses, as we are doing here. 9/11, of course, was a wake-up call for many people, as JFK was a generation earlier. And as COVID has been for people of the new generation, they prove that, of course, there is such a thing as politics of spectacle, politics of hidden agendas being played out in a theatresque way. But I do not want to distract from the content of what we have just discussed. The content, which of course is very tragic in the final reckoning, and in no way do we distract here from the enormous suffering of the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which has, by the way, indirectly been described by Dr. Palmer here in his book, the horrendous wounds inflicted on people, the horrendous casualty rates resulting from the weapons that were used. I think that this all being said, we can wrap up the session unless you would like to add something, Dr. Paul.
No, I think we have really covered much of the ground. Thank you very much for this very interesting and enjoyable conversation. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, then I'd like to thank you, Professor Palmer, for attending this first Polaris book review, and our audience for tuning in. I advise people, our audience, to investigate the books for themselves, to form their own opinion, and to spread it. After all, it is free. The links will be found under this podcast. We thank you and goodbye.